There's something kind of strange about the way this movie announces itself. Not with a roar, not with some grand, self-important Marvel speech about destiny or gods or whatever, but with this almost awkward, self-aware grin that feels like it's looking right at you and going, yeah, we know exactly what this is. And that's the thing that hit me the very first time I watched the trailer for Thor, Love and Thunder. It doesn't feel like a continuation in the traditional sense. It feels like a response, almost like a reaction to everything that came before it. Not just within the Thor films, but the entire MCU machine that had, by that point, become this massive, polished, sometimes overly serious cinematic ecosystem. You remember where we left Thor, right? He wasn't the Shakespearean god from the early days anymore. He wasn't even the broken, grief-stricken warrior from Infinity War. By the end of Endgame, he was something else entirely. A guy drifting, a little lost, hiding behind humor, trying to figure out who he even is when the whole King of Asgard thing doesn't really define him anymore. And the trailer leans hard into that identity crisis, but it does it in a way that's almost disarming. It opens with this montage that feels weirdly peaceful. Thor running through forests, trying to meditate, doing this almost comical attempt at self-discovery. There's a voiceover that sounds reflective, like he's finally slowing down for the first time in years. But even in those quiet moments, there's this undercurrent of instability, like he's forcing himself into calm rather than actually finding it. Then the tone shifts, not dramatically, not with a loud explosion, but with this subtle pivot. Suddenly you realize this isn't going to be a slow, introspective story. The humor creeps in. That very specific, slightly absurd, almost improvisational energy that Taika Waititi brought to Ragnarok is back, but it's dialed up in a way that feels even more confident, and maybe a little more reckless. And I'll be honest, watching it the first time, I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Because on one hand, it's refreshing. After years of increasingly heavy, interconnected storytelling, seeing a Marvel movie just kind of breathe, joke, lean into its own ridiculousness, that's appealing. But on the other hand, there's this question hanging over the whole thing. Is it too much? The trailer doesn't really answer that. Instead, it keeps layering moments. You've got Thor training with this almost Rocky-style montage, except it's played for laughs. You've got the Guardians of the Galaxy popping in just enough to remind you that yes, this is still part of that larger universe, even if it's trying to feel a little more standalone. And then there's that reveal. Jane Foster. Or more specifically, Jane Foster holding Mjolnir. Now, that moment is doing a lot of work. It's not just a surprise cameo. It's not just fan service, it's a statement. Because if you've followed these films, you know Jane hasn't been part of Thor's story in a meaningful way for a long time. Her sudden reappearance, and not just reappearance, but transformation into something powerful, something mythic, it immediately shifts the emotional center of the story. And the trailer knows that. It doesn't rush past it. It lets that moment sit. Thor's reaction isn't played purely for comedy, even though there's humor in it. There's confusion, there's history, there's something unresolved there. And suddenly, what looked like a light, almost carefree adventure starts to feel like it might actually be about something deeper. But then, almost as quickly as it builds that emotional weight, the trailer pivots again. Bright colors, explosions, goats screaming, and I mean really screaming, in a way that's so absurd you almost don't know whether to laugh or question your life choices. And that's kind of the defining rhythm of the whole thing. It's constantly pulling you between sincerity and satire, between emotional stakes and outright parody. It doesn't want to sit in one tone for too long, which can either feel exhilarating or a little disorienting, depending on what you're expecting. Visually, though, there's no denying it has personality. The color palette alone tells you this isn't trying to be grounded or realistic. It's bold, almost aggressively vibrant. It leans into that cosmic, otherworldly aesthetic in a way that feels more like a graphic novel come to life than a traditional superhero film. And then you get glimpses of the villain, Gorr, played by Christian Bale, and you can feel it even in those brief shots. There's a completely different energy there. While everything else in the trailer feels loud and chaotic and playful, Gorr is quiet, controlled, almost unsettlingly calm. And that contrast, it's intentional. You can tell the film is setting up this clash not just of characters, but of tones. On one side, you've got this almost comedic, chaotic version of heroism. On the other, something darker, more focused, more driven by pain and purpose. And the trailer doesn't fully explain him. It doesn't give you his whole story. It just gives you enough. A look, a line, a presence, to make you realize that beneath all the jokes and color and noise, there's going to be something heavier lurking underneath. Which brings me back to that initial feeling, that this movie isn't just continuing Thor's story, it's questioning it. Who is he now? What does being a god even mean in a universe that's already moved past the idea of gods as untouchable figures? Can he still be a hero if he doesn't take himself seriously? Or is that exactly what makes him human enough to matter? The trailer doesn't answer those questions. It kind of dances around them, throws jokes at them, distracts you with spectacle. But they're there. You can feel them in the gaps between the big moments. And maybe that's what makes it interesting, and also a little risky. Because it's one thing to balance humor and emotion when you're reinventing a character like they did in Ragnarok. It's another thing entirely to push that balance even further, especially when the audience already has expectations, not just for Thor, but for what a Marvel movie is supposed to deliver at this point. So as the trailer wraps up and you're left with this mix of laughter, curiosity, and just a hint of uncertainty, you realize something kind of important. This isn't a safe movie. It's not trying to be the next Endgame. It's not trying to carry the weight of the entire universe on its shoulders. It's doing something a little more unpredictable, a little more personal, and maybe, depending on how it all comes together, a little more divisive. And honestly, that might be exactly what Thor needed. And that lingering feeling that this might go somewhere a little messier, a little more emotionally unpredictable than the trailer lets on, is exactly where the full story starts to reveal what it's actually trying to do underneath all that color and noise. Because when the film opens, it doesn't even start with Thor. It takes its time stepping into the darkness first, and that choice matters more than it might seem at first glance. You're dropped into this harsh, almost lifeless environment, a world that feels stripped of hope. There's no humor here, no bright palette, none of that playful energy the trailer leaned into. Instead, it's quiet in a way that feels heavy. And that's where you meet Gorr, long before he becomes the figure the trailer teases. He's not introduced as a villain in the traditional sense. There's no grand entrance, no immediate threat. He's just a man who's been through something devastating. You can feel the loss before you even fully understand it. The way he moves, the way he speaks. There's this emptiness there, like something inside him has already broken beyond repair. And what the film does, which I honestly didn't expect it to commit to this early, is it lets you sit in that pain. It doesn't rush to explain everything. It lets you watch him struggle, believe, hope, and then slowly realize that the faith he's been holding on to might not mean anything at all. That's where the turning point happens. Not with a loud explosion, but with betrayal. Or at least what feels like betrayal from his perspective. And when he finally picks up that weapon, when he steps into that role of the God Butcher, it doesn't feel like a transformation into evil. It feels like someone deciding that the world he believed in isn't worth believing in anymore. And that's such an important foundation, because it reframes everything that comes later. So when the story shifts back to Thor, the tone change is almost jarring on purpose. He's out there with the Guardians, drifting from one conflict to another, but there's a sense that none of it really matters to him the way it used to. He's helping people, sure. He's still powerful, still capable, still very much a hero in the traditional sense, but emotionally, he's disconnected. There's this one moment early on, and it's subtle, not something the movie underlines, where he finishes a battle, everyone around him is celebrating, and he just kind of stands there, slightly out of sync with the energy. Like he's going through the motions of being Thor without actually feeling it. And that's where the humor starts to feel different compared to Ragnarok. It's still there, still loud and weird and sometimes intentionally ridiculous, but there's an edge to it now. It feels like Thor is using it as a shield more than ever before. Even his interactions with the Guardians carry that vibe. There's this underlying sense that he doesn't quite belong with them, even though he's trying to convince himself that he does. You can see it in the way he overcompensates, the way he leans into being the strong one, the funny one, almost like he's playing a role rather than just being himself. And eventually, that drift comes to an end. Not because he finds clarity, but because something pulls him back, something personal. The moment he hears about the attacks on gods, about this mysterious figure leaving destruction in his wake, there's a shift. It's not immediate, not dramatic, but you can feel his focus tightening. For the first time, it feels like something has his full attention again. And that's when the story starts to narrow in on its core conflict. Because Thor isn't just chasing a villain. He's stepping into a narrative that directly challenges everything he represents. Gorr isn't attacking random targets. He's targeting gods specifically, questioning their worth, their purpose, their right to exist. And whether Thor wants to admit it or not, that question hits closer to home than he's comfortable with. So when he eventually crosses paths with Jane, and this is where the film really starts to layer its emotional threads, it doesn't feel like a coincidence or a gimmick. It feels like two completely different journeys colliding at exactly the right moment. Jane's story has been unfolding off-screen for the most part, but when you see her now, there's an immediate sense that she's carrying something heavy too. She's not just back, she's changed. Stronger, yes, but also more guarded, more aware of the cost of everything she's doing. And the way the film handles their reunion is surprisingly restrained. There's humor, of course. It would almost feel unnatural at this point if there wasn't. But underneath that, there's this awkwardness, this history that neither of them quite knows how to navigate anymore. They're not the same people who fell in love all those years ago. And yet, there's still something there, something unresolved, something that neither of them has fully let go of. And that tension becomes one of the driving forces of the story moving forward, because it's not just about rekindling a relationship, it's about confronting who they were, who they've become, and whether those two versions can even coexist. Meanwhile, the threat of Gorr continues to grow in the background, but it doesn't feel like a ticking clock in the traditional sense. It feels more like a shadow slowly stretching across the story, influencing everything without always being directly present. Every time you cut back to him, there's this eerie calmness. He's not rushing, he's not chaotic, he's methodical, focused. And that makes him feel more dangerous than any loud, explosive villain ever could. There's a sequence, and it's one of the more visually striking parts of the early film, where he confronts a group of gods, and the way it's shot, the way the lighting shifts, the way the sound design almost drops out at certain moments. It creates this atmosphere that's completely different from the rest of the movie. It's unsettling, and it reinforces the idea that this story is operating on two very different emotional frequencies at the same time. On one side, you've got Thor and Jane navigating humor, awkwardness, lingering affection, and their own personal struggles. On the other, you've got Gorr moving through this darker, almost mythological space where everything feels more serious, more final. And as these threads start to pull closer together, you can feel the film building towards something that isn't just a physical confrontation, but an ideological one. Because at its core, this isn't just about stopping a villain. It's about answering a question that the movie keeps circling without ever fully stating out loud. What makes a god worth believing in? And for Thor, that's not an easy question anymore. And the uncomfortable truth is, Thor doesn't actually have an answer yet. You can feel that hesitation in the way he reacts to everything that follows, especially once the stakes stop being abstract and start becoming personal in a way he can't ignore anymore. Because up to this point, he's been drifting, helping where he can, laughing things off, avoiding anything that might force him to really look inward. But that luxury starts slipping away the moment Gorr's actions begin to affect people Thor actually cares about. There's this gradual tightening of the narrative, almost like the film is pulling all its threads into one place, whether the characters are ready or not. The Guardians drift out of the picture in a way that feels natural. Not abrupt, just inevitable. Thor's path is clearly moving in a different direction, one that's less about cosmic adventures and more about something grounded in emotion, even if the setting itself remains larger than life. And then the story starts to linger more on Jane, not just as mighty Thor, not just as this powerful figure wielding Mjolnir, but as a person dealing with something incredibly human underneath all of that strength. The film doesn't rush to reveal everything she's going through, but it gives you enough to sense that her transformation comes with a cost, and not a symbolic one, a real cost. And the way it contrasts with Thor's journey is honestly kind of heartbreaking when you think about it. He's been trying to figure out his purpose, searching for meaning after losing so much, while she has found something that gives her purpose again. But it might be taking something away from her in return. So every moment they share starts to carry this unspoken weight. There's a scene, quiet, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention, where they're just talking, not fighting, not joking, just existing in the same space. And you can feel how much history sits between them. Not just the good parts, but the distance, the time apart, the things they never resolved. And for a brief second, the movie slows down enough to let that breathe. But it doesn't stay there long, because the threat keeps pushing forward. Gorr's presence starts to feel less like a distant shadow and more like something closing in. His actions aren't random, they're deliberate, almost philosophical in a way that makes every encounter feel like a statement, rather than just another step in a villain's plan. And that's where the film does something interesting. It doesn't rush Thor into confrontation. It lets him hesitate, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. Because facing Gorr isn't just about strength, it's about what Thor represents. And if he's not sure of that himself, how does he stand against someone who's built his entire mission around tearing that idea apart? So instead of charging straight into battle, there's this period where Thor is thinking, reflecting in his own awkward, sometimes clumsy way, trying to reconcile the version of himself he used to be with the person he's become. And it's not a smooth process. There are moments where he leans too hard into humor, almost like he's trying to avoid the seriousness of the situation. Moments where he overcompensates, trying to prove, maybe to others, maybe to himself, that he's still the hero he's supposed to be. But those moments don't quite land the way he expects them to. And that's intentional. Because the film is quietly stripping away that facade, forcing him into a space where he can't just joke his way through things anymore. At the same time, Jane's arc continues to deepen. Her connection to Mjolnir isn't treated as a simple empowerment story. It's complicated. There's strength in it, yes, but there's also this underlying tension, a sense that every time she taps into that power, something is shifting beneath the surface. And Thor starts to notice. Not immediately, not in some dramatic revelation, but gradually. Small details. The way she recovers after a fight, the way she brushes things off when he asks questions, the way she changes the subject whenever things get too real. And that creates this subtle but growing conflict between them. Because Thor, for all his flaws, does care. And when he realizes that something might be wrong, his instinct isn't to ignore it, it's to push closer, to try to understand. But Jane isn't ready to let him in like that. Not yet. So their relationship becomes this push and pull, connection and distance happening at the same time, neither one fully willing or able to confront what's really going on underneath. Meanwhile, Gorr's story continues to unfold in parallel, and this is where the film really leans into its darker edge. There's a sequence where he interacts with children, and it's handled in a way that's unsettling without being overtly graphic. The tone shifts again, the humor drops away almost entirely, and you're left with this sense that his mission isn't just about destruction. It's about proving something, about making a point that he believes the universe needs to see. And the more you watch him, the more you understand that, in his mind, he's not the villain of this story. He's the correction, which makes the eventual collision between these characters feel inevitable, but also more complicated than a simple good versus evil setup. Because by the time Thor and Gorr finally come face to face, and the film takes its time getting there, building tension rather than rushing into it, it doesn't feel like a typical showdown. It feels like a confrontation between two completely different perspectives on what power means. Gorr sees gods as selfish, indifferent, unworthy of worship. Thor isn't entirely sure how to defend against that anymore. And that uncertainty shows, not in weakness, but in hesitation. In the way he approaches the situation, the way he listens, even if he doesn't agree. There's a part of him that recognizes the pain driving Gorr, even if he can't accept the path he's taken. And that's where the film finds some of its most interesting tension. Because it's not just asking whether Thor can stop Gorr, it's asking whether Thor can prove him wrong. And as everything starts to build toward that larger conflict, emotionally, thematically, physically, you can feel the story tightening its grip, pulling all these threads closer together, preparing for something that's going to force every character to confront the truth they've been avoiding. Because eventually, all that avoidance runs out of road. There's a point where the story just stops letting these characters orbit around their problems, and instead forces them straight into the center of them. And it happens in a way that feels less like a traditional escalation, and more like an emotional collision that's been building quietly in the background this entire time. And it really starts to lock in once the film leans harder into the idea that this isn't just Thor's story. It never really was. What you begin to realize, almost gradually, almost reluctantly, is that the narrative weight is shifting between Thor, Jane, and Gorr in a way that feels surprisingly balanced. Not equal in screen time necessarily, but equal in thematic importance. Each of them is carrying a different version of the same question, just from completely opposite directions. And once that clicks, the way the story unfolds starts to feel more intentional, because Thor's journey isn't about becoming stronger. That part is already settled. We've seen him at his peak, we've seen him broken, we've seen him rebuild. There's no mystery there anymore. What he's struggling with now is meaning, something much harder to define, much harder to fight for. Jane, on the other hand, has found clarity in a way that's almost cruel in its timing. Her purpose is crystal clear. She knows what she's doing, why she's doing it, and what it might cost her. And that certainty gives her strength. But it also isolates her, because it means she's carrying something she doesn't want to fully share. And then there's Gorr, who operates with a kind of terrifying conviction that neither of them can match. He's already made his decision. There's no doubt left in him, no hesitation. In his mind, the universe has already proven his point. He's just the one acting on it. So when the story starts bringing them closer together, it doesn't feel like a typical convergence of plot lines. It feels like three completely different emotional trajectories intersecting at exactly the wrong, or maybe the only, possible moment. There's a stretch in the middle where the pacing shifts again, but this time it's less about tonal contrast and more about focus. The film narrows in, strips away some of the chaos, and starts giving more space to the characters' internal conflicts. Thor begins to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. He listens more. He jokes less. Not entirely, because that's still part of who he is now, but there's a noticeable difference in how often he uses humor to deflect. It becomes less of a shield and more of a natural extension of his personality, which is a subtle but important shift. There's a scene where he's talking to Valkyrie, and it's not played for laughs, not really. There's a quiet honesty there, a kind of mutual understanding between two people who've both lost a lot and are still trying to figure out what comes next. And for the first time in the film, Thor doesn't try to wrap everything in optimism or humor. He just admits that he doesn't have it all figured out. And that moment lands harder than any big speech could have, because it feels real in a way that the character hasn't allowed himself to be for a long time. At the same time, Jane's situation becomes impossible to ignore. The film stops dancing around it and starts confronting it more directly, but even then, it avoids melodrama. There's no over-the-top reveal, no exaggerated emotional breakdown. It's handled with a kind of quiet inevitability that makes it hit even harder. Thor realizes what's happening, not all at once, but piece by piece. And the way he processes that realization is complicated. There's frustration, obviously. There's a part of him that wants to fix it, to find some way around it because that's what he's always done. He fights, he solves problems, he refuses to accept limits. But this isn't that kind of situation. And slowly, painfully, he starts to understand that, which forces him into a position he's not comfortable with at all. One where he can't just act, can't just charge forward and expect everything to fall into place. He has to sit with it, accept it, support her without trying to control the outcome. And that's a different kind of strength than anything we've seen from him before. Meanwhile, Gorr's presence becomes more immediate, more invasive, in a way that starts to affect the emotional tone of every scene he touches. There's less distance now. He's not operating in the background anymore. He's stepping directly into the narrative, confronting the heroes in ways that feel personal. And when those confrontations happen, they're not structured like traditional battles. They're conversations. Tense, uncomfortable, layered with meaning that goes beyond the surface of what's being said. Gorr doesn't just attack physically. He challenges, he questions, he forces Thor to confront the possibility that maybe, in some cases, gods haven't been what they're supposed to be. And the film doesn't rush to shut that down. It lets the question hang there, which is what makes the eventual escalation feel earned rather than forced. Because by the time things start to tip into full conflict, it's not just about stopping Gorr's plan. It's about everything these characters have been wrestling with internally, finally reaching a breaking point. There's a sequence, visually striking, tonally different from almost anything else in the film, where the environment itself feels stripped down, almost abstract. The colors fade, the sound design shifts, and for a moment, it feels like the story has stepped outside of its own reality. And in that space, the confrontation takes on a different weight. It's not loud, it's not chaotic, it's focused. Every movement, every line of dialogue feels deliberate, like the film is narrowing everything down to its core themes without distraction. Thor isn't fighting to prove he's stronger. Jane isn't fighting to prove she belongs. Gorr isn't fighting just to destroy. They're all, in their own ways, trying to justify the paths they've chosen. And as that tension builds, as the emotional stakes and the physical stakes start to align, you can feel the story approaching something that isn't going to resolve cleanly. Because there's no version of this where everyone walks away unchanged. And the film knows that. It leans into it. It allows the weight of those choices to settle in, even as the spectacle ramps up around them. So when everything finally begins to tip toward that inevitable climax, it doesn't feel like a sudden shift into action for the sake of action. It feels like the only possible outcome of everything that's been building beneath the surface this entire time. And what's striking is how little the film is actually interested in a clean, triumphant resolution once it gets there. Because when that final stretch begins to unfold, there's no sense of relief. No, this is where the hero turns the tide and everything clicks into place. Instead, it feels heavier, almost like the story is asking one last question and refusing to give anyone an easy way out of answering it. By this point, Thor has changed in ways that aren't loud or obvious, but you feel them in how he carries himself. There's less performance, less need to prove something. The confidence is still there, but it's quieter now, grounded in something more honest than before. And that matters, because the situation he's walking into doesn't respond to bravado. It responds to intent. Jane, meanwhile, is operating on a different kind of clarity. There's no hesitation left in her. Whatever internal conflict she had earlier in the story has settled into a kind of calm acceptance. And that's both inspiring and deeply unsettling at the same time. Because you understand what that acceptance means, even if the film doesn't spell it out in big, dramatic terms. And Gorr, he hasn't changed at all. That's the most unnerving part. While Thor and Jane have been evolving, questioning themselves, adjusting their perspectives, Gorr has remained completely fixed. His belief system is solid, unshaken by anything he's encountered so far. If anything, every step of the journey has reinforced what he already thinks. So when they all finally converge in that last act, it doesn't feel like a typical climax where the villain is about to be defeated and the heroes are about to win. It feels like a confrontation where every outcome comes with a cost. There's a moment, and it's not framed as a grand turning point, which makes it even more effective, where Thor realizes that this isn't a fight he can win the way he's used to winning. Strength alone isn't going to solve this. There's no clever trick, no last-minute power boost that's going to suddenly shift the balance. What matters now is choice. And more specifically, the kind of choice that defines who you are when everything else is stripped away. The film slows down just enough in that moment to let you sit with that realization. The action doesn't stop, but it feels secondary for a brief stretch, like the emotional core of the scene is taking priority over the spectacle. And then Jane steps forward in a way that feels both inevitable and completely devastating, because everything about her journey has been building toward this. Not in a predictable, formulaic sense, but in a way that feels tragically logical. Every decision she's made, every risk she's taken, every moment she's pushed past her own limits, it all leads here. And the film doesn't try to soften that. It doesn't wrap it in comforting language or distracting humor. It lets it be what it is. Thor's reaction to that is where you really see how much he's grown, because the old version of him would have tried to fight it, to override it, to refuse to accept what's happening. But here, there's this painful restraint. He doesn't stop caring. If anything, he cares more deeply than ever, but he understands that this isn't something he can control. And that understanding, it changes how he approaches everything that follows. So when the confrontation with Gorr reaches its peak, it doesn't explode into chaos the way you might expect. There's intensity, absolutely, but it's focused, almost intimate, despite the scale of what's at stake. Gorr finally gets what he's been chasing. That's the part that flips the entire dynamic. For a brief moment, it looks like everything he's been working toward is within his reach, and the film doesn't rush past that. It lets you feel the weight of it, not just as a plot point, but as the culmination of his entire belief system. And here's where things get interesting, because instead of resolving that moment through force, the story leans into something much quieter, something emotional. Thor doesn't try to overpower Gorr. He speaks to him. Not in a speechy, over-the-top way, but in a grounded, almost raw way that feels consistent with the journey he's been on. He doesn't deny the flaws in what Gorr is saying. He doesn't pretend that gods have always been worthy or just or selfless. He acknowledges the pain. But he also offers something Gorr hasn't allowed himself to consider. The idea that purpose isn't fixed, that it can change, that even someone who's lost everything can choose something different in the end. And whether or not you fully buy into that depends on how you read Gorr as a character. But the film commits to it in a way that feels sincere rather than manipulative. Because the decision Gorr makes in that moment doesn't feel like a sudden redemption. It feels like the first crack in something that's been solid for too long. And that crack is enough. What follows isn't triumphant, it's quiet. Bittersweet in a way that lingers. Because even as the immediate threat is resolved, the cost of getting there doesn't disappear. Jane's story reaches its conclusion in a way that feels earned, but not easy. There's no attempt to undo what's been building throughout the film. Thor is left to process that, and the way the film handles his reaction is surprisingly restrained. There's grief, obviously, but it's not framed as something that defines him moving forward. It's part of him now, another layer in a character who's already been shaped by loss in so many different ways. But this time, it feels different. Because it's not just about what he's lost, it's about what he's learned. And that's where the film finds a kind of quiet resolution that doesn't rely on spectacle or closure in the traditional sense. Thor doesn't walk away with all the answers. He doesn't suddenly become this perfectly balanced, fully realized version of himself. But he's changed. There's a sense that he understands something now that he didn't before. Not just about being a god, but about being a person, about connection, about responsibility, about the idea that strength isn't always about fighting harder, but sometimes about knowing when to let go, when to listen, when to choose something other than the path you've been following. And as the story begins to settle into its final moments, there's this feeling that, for the first time in a long time, Thor isn't searching anymore. He's found something. Maybe not everything, but enough. And sitting with that ending for a minute, letting it actually settle instead of rushing past it the way a lot of these films tend to do, it starts to feel like this movie arrived at a very specific moment for a reason. Because when you zoom out a little, not just from the story, but from the industry around it, Thor: Love and Thunder doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands at a time when the Marvel machine had already proven it could build to something massive, something almost culturally overwhelming. Endgame wasn't just a movie, it was a full-stop moment. And everything that came after that had this strange pressure attached to it. Not necessarily to be bigger, because honestly, how do you even top something like that in a meaningful way? But to justify its own existence. To prove that there were still stories worth telling in a universe that had already delivered its most definitive conclusion. And that's where this film makes a choice that I think is easy to overlook if you're only watching it on the surface. It doesn't try to compete with that scale. It doesn't position itself as the next major turning point for the MCU, the next essential chapter you need to understand everything else. Instead, it leans into something smaller, more character-driven, even if the visuals and the setting are still massive. And that's not an accident. You can feel it in the way the story is structured, in the way it prioritizes emotional arcs over plot mechanics, in the way it's willing to spend time on moments that don't necessarily move the larger universe forward, but do move these characters forward in a very real way. At the same time, though, it's operating within a system that doesn't fully let it detach from that bigger picture. There are expectations baked into the MCU now. Connections, setups, continuity threads that extend beyond a single film. And Love and Thunder kind of dances around that. It acknowledges the larger world, but it doesn't let that world dominate the story. And that balance is tricky, because depending on what you're looking for as an audience member, it can either feel refreshing or slightly disconnected. If you're expecting something that ties directly into the next big crossover, this might feel like a detour. But if you're more interested in seeing these characters evolve in a meaningful way, it actually works in the film's favor. There's also the question of tone, which has become one of the defining conversations around this movie. After Ragnarok, Taika Waititi essentially reshaped Thor into a character that could carry both humor and emotional weight in a way that hadn't quite worked before. That film struck a balance that felt new at the time. Lighter, more self-aware, but still grounded enough to make the serious moments land. With Love and Thunder, that balance shifts again. And whether or not that shift works for you really depends on how much you're willing to go along with it. Because the humor here is more frequent, more exaggerated, sometimes even intentionally disruptive. There are moments where it undercuts tension instead of enhancing it. Moments where it feels like the film is almost testing how far it can push that tone before it breaks. And to be fair, sometimes it gets very close to that edge. But what's interesting is that underneath all of that, the emotional core is still very much intact. It's not ignored, it's not brushed aside, it's just surrounded by a lot more noise. So you end up with this film that feels a little contradictory on the surface. It's loud and colorful and chaotic, but it's also dealing with themes that are actually pretty heavy when you stop and think about them. Loss, belief, purpose, mortality. Those aren't light topics, even if the film doesn't always treat them with the same level of seriousness from moment to moment. And that contrast is going to hit people differently. Some are going to see it as bold, as a willingness to take risks within a formula that can sometimes feel too rigid. Others are going to see it as uneven, like the film can't quite decide what it wants to be. And honestly, both perspectives have some truth to them. From an industry standpoint, though, it's kind of fascinating, because this is a Marvel movie that isn't trying to be universally appealing in the safest possible way. It has a very specific voice, a very specific style, and it sticks to it even when that might alienate part of the audience. And that's not something you see all the time in a franchise at this scale. You also have to consider where these actors are at this point in their careers. Chris Hemsworth has been playing Thor for over a decade now, and you can feel that experience in his performance. There's a comfort there, but also a willingness to explore different sides of the character. He's not just repeating what worked before. He's adjusting, experimenting, even when it doesn't always land perfectly. Natalie Portman coming back into this world after such a long gap adds another layer to that dynamic. There's a sense that her presence isn't just about nostalgia or continuity. It actually changes the emotional landscape of the film in a meaningful way. And then you've got Christian Bale, who brings a completely different acting style into this environment. His approach to Gorr feels almost like it belongs in a darker, more grounded film, which creates this interesting tension with the more exaggerated tone around him. From a production standpoint, you can tell this wasn't a film trying to play it safe. The visual style is bold, to the point of being almost confrontational at times. The humor is unfiltered. The storytelling choices aren't always aligned with what the audience might expect from a typical Marvel entry. And that's going to make it stand out, for better or worse. Because in a franchise where consistency has often been the key to success, Love and Thunder feels like a deliberate step away from that consistency. Not a complete break, but enough of a shift to make you notice. And whether that's something the MCU can continue to build on, or whether it's just a one-off experiment within a larger system, that's a bigger question. But as a standalone piece, as a film that exists on its own terms, it's doing something that a lot of big-budget superhero movies don't always feel comfortable doing. It's taking risks. Not all of them pay off, but the fact that they're there at all, that's worth paying attention to. And when you start really looking at the people inside this story, not just as characters serving a plot, but as performances shaped by years of history, both on screen and off, that's where the film opens up in a completely different way. Because casting in a franchise like this isn't just about who fits the role anymore. It's about legacy. It's about how much emotional weight an actor brings with them the moment they step into frame. Take Chris Hemsworth. There was a time, early on, where Thor felt like the most rigid character in the MCU lineup. He had the look, the presence, the physicality, but something about the performance felt constrained, like he was stuck inside a version of the character that didn't fully allow for personality. And over the years, you've watched that evolve. By the time you get to Ragnarok, there's this sudden release, humor, looseness, a sense that Hemsworth is finally playing the character instead of just embodying him. And Love and Thunder takes that version and pushes it even further, but not in a way that's just about being funnier or louder. There's a vulnerability here that feels earned, not in big dramatic monologues, but in the smaller moments, the pauses, the way he reacts instead of initiates, the way his confidence sometimes feels like it's being held together rather than naturally flowing. It's the performance of someone who understands the character deeply enough to let him be flawed without trying to smooth those edges out. And that's not easy to maintain after this many films, because repetition is always a risk in long-running roles. It's very easy to fall into patterns, to rely on what's worked before. But Hemsworth avoids that for the most part by leaning into the changes the character has gone through, rather than pretending they don't exist. Then there's Natalie Portman, and her presence changes the energy of the film in a way that's hard to overstate. When she first appeared in the earlier Thor films, Jane Foster felt like she belonged to a different kind of story, more grounded, more tied to science than mythology. There was always a slight disconnect between her world and Thor's, even when they were sharing scenes. Coming back into this version of the MCU, she feels different. Not just because of the physical transformation, not just because she's now wielding power in a way she never did before, but because there's a sense of purpose behind her performance that wasn't as prominent the first time around. She's not just reacting to Thor anymore. She's carrying her own narrative weight, her own emotional arc that stands on its own even when it intersects with his. And that gives the relationship between them a balance that it didn't quite have before. There's also something interesting about the way she plays the duality of her character, the contrast between strength and vulnerability. It's not exaggerated, it's not overly dramatized. It's subtle enough that you sometimes feel it more than you see it. And that subtlety is important, because it keeps the character grounded even when the story around her becomes increasingly fantastical. Now, Christian Bale as Gorr, that's where the film takes one of its biggest swings. Because Bale doesn't adjust his performance to match the tone of the rest of the movie. If anything, he does the opposite. He commits fully to a version of this character that feels like it's coming from a completely different genre. And somehow, that works more often than you'd expect. There's a restraint in his performance that makes it unsettling. He doesn't rely on volume or exaggerated gestures. He's quiet, controlled, and that makes every moment he's on screen feel heavier. It's almost like he's operating on a different emotional frequency than everyone else. And that contrast between his grounded, intense approach and the film's more colorful, chaotic tone creates this tension that adds depth to the story, even when the script doesn't fully explore it as much as it could have. You also have Tessa Thompson returning as Valkyrie, and her role here is interesting because it reflects another side of leadership that the film doesn't spend a lot of time highlighting, but still acknowledges. She's in a position of power now, ruling New Asgard, and there's a sense that the responsibility of that role has changed her in subtle ways. She's still the same character at her core, but there's a layer of fatigue there, a sense that leadership comes with its own kind of isolation. And even though her screen time isn't as dominant as Thor or Jane's, she adds texture to the world, a reminder that these characters exist beyond just the central conflict. The supporting cast, including the Guardians in their brief appearances, serve more as connective tissue than fully developed parts of the story. But that's by design. Their presence helps establish where Thor is emotionally at the beginning, and their absence helps emphasize how his journey becomes more personal as the film progresses. Even smaller roles, the kind that could easily feel disposable, are given just enough personality to make them memorable, which speaks to the film's overall approach to character. It's less about building a perfectly balanced ensemble, and more about creating a world where everyone feels like they exist for a reason, even if that reason is only explored briefly. And then there's the chemistry. Not just romantic chemistry, but the way these actors interact with each other on a scene-by-scene basis. Thor and Jane's dynamic carries history, but it also carries uncertainty. You can feel the years between them, the things that were left unsaid, the emotional distance that hasn't fully closed. Thor and Valkyrie share a different kind of connection, one built on mutual understanding rather than romance. There's a shorthand between them that doesn't need to be explained, which makes their scenes feel natural even when the dialogue leans into humor. And Thor and Gorr, that's less about chemistry and more about contrast. They don't mirror each other. They don't reflect different sides of the same coin in a simple way. Instead, they represent completely different responses to loss, to belief, to purpose. And that's what makes their interactions compelling. Because it's not just about who wins or loses, it's about whose perspective holds up when everything else falls away. And when you put all of that together, the performances, the dynamics, the choices each actor makes within the framework they're given, you start to see the film less as a collection of scenes and more as a series of character studies loosely connected by a larger narrative. Some of those studies are more fully realized than others. Some feel like they could have gone deeper, but none of them feel phoned in. And in a franchise this big, this long-running, that alone is something worth recognizing. And what's interesting is, once you step away from all of that, the performances, the industry context, the expectations, and just look at the film from a distance, almost like you're trying to explain it to someone who hasn't seen it yet, the shape of it becomes surprisingly simple. Not simplistic, but clear in its intent. Because at its core, this is a story about people trying to hold on to something. Belief, love, purpose, in a universe that keeps taking things away from them. And the film doesn't present that idea in a straight line. It circles around it. It approaches it from different angles, sometimes through humor, sometimes through action, sometimes through moments that are so quiet they almost feel out of place in a movie this big. But if you track those threads carefully, you start to see how everything connects. Thor is holding on to identity. Not the title, not the power. Those things are almost secondary now. But the idea of who he is when all the roles he's played don't fully define him anymore. He's been a prince, a king, an avenger, a warrior, and now he's in this space where none of those labels feel complete. So what's left? That question doesn't get answered in one moment. It unfolds gradually, through his interactions, through the way he responds to loss, through the way he learns to stop forcing himself into a version of Thor that doesn't fit anymore. Jane is holding on to time. Her story is much more immediate, much more grounded in the reality of what she's facing. Every decision she makes carries weight because she knows exactly what it might cost her. There's a clarity there that Thor doesn't have. Not because she's stronger or more certain as a person, but because her circumstances don't allow for hesitation. And that gives her arc a kind of emotional sharpness that cuts through the film's more chaotic elements. She doesn't have the luxury of drifting. Every moment matters. Gorr is holding on to meaning, but in a way that's been twisted by loss to the point where it's almost unrecognizable. He started with belief, genuine, hopeful belief. And what he's become is someone who sees that belief as a lie that needs to be exposed. And the film never fully lets you dismiss that perspective. It challenges it, it pushes back against it, but it doesn't reduce it to something simple or easily defeated. There's always this underlying sense that his anger comes from somewhere real, even if his actions go too far. So when all of these arcs come together, the story doesn't feel like it's building toward a single, definitive answer. It feels like it's presenting a series of choices. Thor choosing to redefine what strength means for him. Jane choosing to act even when she knows the cost. Gorr choosing whether or not to hold on to the version of the world he's constructed out of his pain. And that's why the film doesn't land like a typical superhero narrative when it ends. There's no clean victory. There's no sense that everything has been resolved in a way that neatly wraps up the themes it's been exploring. Instead, there's this lingering feeling, not of incompleteness, but of continuation. Like the story has reached a point where it can pause, but not fully conclude. And that's reflected in the tone of those final moments. They're not loud. They're not trying to overwhelm you with spectacle or emotion. They're almost reflective. Thor's journey doesn't end with him standing at the top of some metaphorical mountain, fully realized and unshakable. It ends with him in motion, but in a different way than before. There's direction there now, even if it's not fully defined. And that's enough. Because for a character who spent so much of his recent history lost, drifting between identities, searching for something to anchor himself to, finding even a partial sense of purpose feels significant. Jane's story, on the other hand, reaches a kind of closure that feels both complete and intentionally unresolved in its emotional impact. It doesn't try to soften the reality of what she's gone through, but it also doesn't frame it purely as tragedy. There's dignity in it, a sense that her choices mattered, that they had meaning beyond just the immediate outcome. And that's what lingers. Not just what happened, but why it mattered. Gorr's arc closes in a way that feels consistent with everything that came before it. There's no sudden shift into a completely different character, no moment where he becomes something he hasn't been building toward. Instead, there's a subtle shift, just enough to suggest that even someone who's gone as far as he has can still make a different choice when it matters most. And whether you see that as redemption or simply as a final moment of clarity depends on how you interpret the character. But it fits. It doesn't feel forced, and that's important, because it allows the film to end on a note that feels earned rather than manufactured. So if you're looking at this story from a purely structural perspective, it might seem uneven in places. The tone shifts, the pacing fluctuates, the balance between humor and seriousness isn't always consistent. But if you're looking at it from a thematic perspective, it's actually pretty focused. It knows what it's exploring. It knows what it wants these characters to confront. And even when the execution doesn't fully align with that intent in every single moment, the core of it remains intact, which, in a film like this, in a franchise like this, is not something you can take for granted. And the thing is, once you've had a little distance from it, once the noise of expectations and comparisons starts to fade, you begin to notice the smaller details. The ones that don't announce themselves. The ones that aren't packaged as big moments, but quietly shape how the whole experience feels. Because Love and Thunder is full of those. There's a visual language in this film that doesn't always get talked about enough, probably because it's so loud on the surface. The colors, the lighting, the way certain environments are designed. It all feels heightened, almost exaggerated at times. But when you look closer, there's intention behind those choices. The brighter, more saturated scenes, they're not just there to look cool. They reflect a version of the world that feels almost artificial, like a heightened reality where everything is turned up just a little too far. It matches the tone of the humor, the energy of the characters when they're leaning into that chaotic, almost performative version of themselves. Then you get those moments where the palette shifts, where everything becomes more muted, more controlled, sometimes even stripped down to near monochrome. And suddenly, the film feels different, more grounded, more serious, like it's pulling back the curtain on everything that's been happening and showing you what's underneath. That contrast isn't accidental. It mirrors what the characters are going through, the difference between how they present themselves to the world and what they're actually dealing with internally. There's also the way the film uses space. Not just physical space, but emotional space. There are scenes where the characters are surrounded by this massive cosmic scale. Planets, gods, entire civilizations. And yet the focus is incredibly tight. The camera lingers on faces, on reactions, on the things that aren't being said. And then there are moments where the opposite happens, where the setting feels almost empty, almost isolated, even when there's technically a lot happening around them. And that emptiness creates this sense of vulnerability that you don't always expect in a movie this big. It's subtle, but it adds depth. The same goes for the humor, which, depending on how you experienced it, might have felt like either one of the film's biggest strengths or one of its biggest distractions. What's interesting is that a lot of the humor isn't just there to make you laugh. It's there to reveal something about the characters. Thor's jokes, especially early on, often feel like they're covering something up. There's an awkwardness to them, a sense that he's trying a little too hard to keep things light, to avoid sitting with anything uncomfortable. And as the story progresses, that changes. Not completely, because humor is still part of who he is now, but it becomes less defensive, more natural, less about avoiding pain and more about coexisting with it. Jane's humor works differently. It's sharper, more grounded, often coming from a place of self-awareness. She knows what she's dealing with, and there's a kind of strength in the way she chooses to approach it. Not by denying it, but by refusing to let it define every moment she has left. And then there are moments where the humor disappears entirely, usually when Gorr is present, and that absence says a lot, because it creates a kind of tonal vacuum, where everything suddenly feels heavier, more real. It's like the film is reminding you that beneath all the color and chaos, there's something serious at stake. Another detail that stands out more on reflection is the way the film handles mythology. Not in the traditional sense of building a coherent, structured mythos, but in the way it treats gods as flawed, almost human figures. There's a sense that being a god in this universe doesn't automatically come with wisdom or responsibility. And that ties directly into the central conflict. Because Gorr's entire mission is built on the idea that gods have failed the people who believed in them. And the film doesn't completely reject that idea. It shows examples of it. It acknowledges that in some cases that failure is real, which makes Thor's journey more meaningful, because it's not just about proving Gorr wrong, it's about becoming something different, something better than the version of a god that Gorr has experienced. There's also a layer of symbolism in the way power is portrayed. Mjolnir, Stormbreaker, these aren't just weapons, they're extensions of identity, of worthiness, of connection to something larger than yourself. And the way those elements are used throughout the film reflects the characters' internal states. Who can wield what, when, and why? It all ties back to where they are emotionally, not just physically. Even the smaller, seemingly throwaway details carry weight when you look at them closely enough. The way Thor interacts with people who aren't gods. The way Jane holds herself differently depending on whether she's in armor or not. The way Gorr moves through spaces like he doesn't belong to them anymore. All of it adds up. And then there are the things the film chooses not to explain. The gaps. The moments where it trusts the audience to fill in the emotional context without spelling everything out. Those choices can be frustrating if you're looking for a fully detailed, tightly constructed narrative. But they also give the story a kind of openness that allows different interpretations. You're not told exactly how to feel about every decision. You're not guided step by step through every emotional beat. Instead, you're given just enough to understand what's happening, and then left to process the rest on your own. And that's where the film starts to linger. Not in the big action sequences or the loudest jokes, but in the quieter questions it leaves behind. About belief, about loss, about what it means to care about something in a world that doesn't always give you a reason to. And those questions don't resolve the moment the credits roll. They stick with you. Maybe not in a way that demands immediate attention, but in a way that surfaces later, when you're thinking back on the film and realizing that it was doing more under the surface than it initially let on. Which is why, even with its inconsistencies, Even with the moments where it feels like it's pushing too far in one direction or another, there's something about it that stays with you. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. And maybe that's the best way to describe the film, in the end. Not as something perfectly balanced, not as something that always lands exactly where it's aiming, but as something that feels honest in its attempt. Because there's a difference between a movie that misses because it doesn't know what it's doing, and a movie that stumbles because it's trying to do more than it can comfortably hold together. This very much feels like the second kind. You can see the ambition in it, not just in the scale, because at this point, scale is expected, but in the tone it's reaching for, in the emotional ground it's trying to cover, while still operating inside a franchise that has its own expectations, its own rhythms, its own built-in audience demands. And balancing all of that is not easy. You can feel that tension throughout the film. There are moments where it leans too far into comedy, where the emotional weight gets undercut just a little too quickly. Moments where you wish it would sit still for just a few seconds longer, let a scene breathe instead of rushing to the next beat. And then there are moments where it does the opposite, where it slows down just enough, where everything lines up. Performance, tone, writing, music, and you get a glimpse of the version of this film that could have existed if it had leaned a little more consistently in that direction. Those glimpses are important because they show you what the film is capable of. They remind you that underneath the unevenness, there's a very clear understanding of what these characters mean and what kind of story they're trying to tell with them. And that's why the conversation around this movie has been so divided. Some people focus on what didn't work. The tonal imbalance, the overuse of humor, the feeling that certain elements weren't given enough time to fully develop. And those criticisms are valid. They're not nitpicks. They're real aspects of the film that affect how it lands. But then there are people who connect with what it was trying to do, who see the emotional through line, who respond to the character arcs, who appreciate the risks it takes even when those risks don't always pay off perfectly. And those reactions are just as valid. Because this isn't a film that's trying to be universally agreeable. It's not designed to hit the exact same note for every audience member. It's reaching for something a little more specific, a little more personal, even within the framework of a massive global franchise. And when a film does that, it's almost guaranteed to create a split response. Some people will meet it where it is. Others will wish it had been something else. Neither side is wrong. It just depends on what you value more as a viewer. Consistency or ambition, polish or personality, control or experimentation. And where you fall on that spectrum will probably determine how you feel about the film overall. For me, it's one of those movies that I don't think is going to age in a straightforward way. It's not going to suddenly become a universally recognized classic, but it's also not something that's going to fade away completely. It's going to sit in that middle space, a film that people revisit, reassess, argue about. A film that maybe feels a little different depending on when you watch it, what you bring to it, what you're looking for at that moment. Because it's not rigid, it doesn't lock itself into a single interpretation. And that flexibility, even when it comes from inconsistency, gives it a kind of longevity that more tightly controlled films don't always have. You might notice different things the second time, or the third. You might find yourself more patient with certain choices, or more critical of others. But either way, you're engaging with it, you're thinking about it, and that, in its own way, is a kind of success. Because the worst thing a film like this can be is forgettable. And whatever else you say about Thor, Love and Thunder, it's not that. It leaves an impression. Messy, uneven, sometimes frustrating, but also sincere, occasionally moving, and undeniably distinct within the larger landscape it belongs to. And in a franchise that's produced as much content as this one has, standing out, even imperfectly, counts for something. It really does. What's also worth noting, and I think this is a subtle layer a lot of casual viewers might miss, is how much the film leans into contrasts, not just in tone, but in philosophy. It's constantly juxtaposing extremes: power versus vulnerability, legacy versus reinvention, vengeance versus forgiveness. Thor's personal evolution is literally framed against Gorr's philosophy, and the film takes its time to let that tension breathe. You can feel it in the dialogue, in the pauses between lines, in how certain sequences are scored. There's a rhythm here that rewards patience, even if it sometimes clashes with the kinetic pace of the action. And speaking of the action, there's a choreography to it that's worth dissecting. This isn't just spectacle for spectacle's sake. The fight sequences, especially the ones involving Thor and Gorr, are structured almost like dances. There's a narrative beat embedded in each swing, each crash of lightning. It's storytelling through combat. You watch Thor's moves evolve not only because he's adapting to an opponent, but because the fight reflects his internal journey. He's less brute force than he was before, more measured, more deliberate, which mirrors the emotional intelligence he's beginning to cultivate. Then there's Jane Foster. Her role is particularly interesting because she doesn't just exist as a narrative catalyst or as a love interest. She's a force in her own right, and the film is careful to give her agency that feels earned. Her transformation into the mighty Thor isn't just cosmetic or symbolic. It's a statement about identity, about reclaiming power in the face of mortality. And the filmmakers lean into the physicality of her character. You can see the subtle nuances in her posture, in how she wields the hammer, how she interacts with Thor and the world around her. It's a careful layering of performance and design, and it elevates her arc beyond the typical superhero side story. Gorr, meanwhile, operates on a completely different plane. His presence carries a philosophical weight that's rare for a mainstream blockbuster villain. He's not evil for the sake of spectacle. His anger is rooted in pain and disillusionment. The script allows him to articulate his motivations with clarity and even grace at times, which is what makes the stakes feel real. You're not just watching Thor versus a generic antagonist. You're watching a clash of worldviews. It's almost Shakespearean in its structure, with hero, antagonist, and moral argument all coexisting in the same space. And the film's visual language supports all of this beautifully. The color design, the composition of frames, the way the environments shift from the grandeur of Asgard to the void of space, to the eerie isolation of Gorr's realm, all of it works in tandem with the narrative. You're constantly being reminded, subtly, of where the characters are emotionally, not just physically. These visual cues are sophisticated, and while they may not register on a conscious level for every viewer, they amplify the story in ways that are almost subliminal. The filmmakers are speaking to you through every frame, if you're paying attention. Another layer that deserves discussion is the soundtrack. This isn't just background music, it's almost a character in its own right. It punctuates emotional beats, emphasizes tension, and even injects levity at just the right moments. You'll notice recurring motifs tied to specific characters or emotional arcs. A subtle orchestral line for Thor's moments of introspection, a heavier, darker motif for Gorr's vengeance. And then, when needed, the score explodes in ways that heighten spectacle without overwhelming the underlying narrative. It's an orchestration that mirrors the film's own oscillation between chaos and reflection. It's also worth pointing out how the film handles pacing. Yes, there are moments where it feels like it's pulling in too many directions, but if you step back and examine the structure, you realize there's a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Moments of high-energy spectacle are deliberately followed by quieter, introspective scenes. The script allows characters to digest events, to process, to react. That pause gives weight to the big sequences. It's the emotional punctuation that keeps the story from becoming a relentless march of action set pieces. It's subtle, but effective, and it shows a respect for the audience's engagement with the material on more than just a surface level. Then there's the humor, which operates on multiple planes. It's not just about jokes landing or failing. It's about revealing character, establishing relationships, and even serving as commentary. Thor's comedic timing, his self-awareness, his occasional awkwardness, all of it tells you who he is post-Endgame, post all the battles he's fought, without ever needing exposition. Jane's wit and intelligence provide contrast and chemistry. Even Gorr has moments where his dialogue lands in a darkly ironic space, giving the film a tonal complexity that's surprisingly rich for a blockbuster. It's humor that doesn't just entertain, it illuminates. And as the story arcs converge, there's an elegance in how the film interweaves character development with plot resolution. Each confrontation isn't just a spectacle, it's a narrative statement. The battles carry emotional stakes that feel earned because the film has invested time in establishing motivations, relationships, and consequences. You're not watching fights for the sake of visual flair. You're watching characters make choices, grapple with consequences, and confront the very essence of who they are. That's what elevates the spectacle to something more than just visual excitement. It becomes narrative storytelling in motion. Finally, what's compelling is how the film leaves space for reflection. Even in its loudest, most chaotic moments, there's a subtext of introspection. You're invited to think about power, about responsibility, about legacy, about the costs of choices. It doesn't always spell things out, and that's intentional. The ambiguity allows you, as a viewer, to engage actively, to interpret, to carry the story with you beyond the theater. That's a rare quality in a film of this scale and ambition, and it's one of the reasons why Thor: Love and Thunder resonates, even if imperfectly, on multiple levels. It's a movie that asks you to consider not just what happens, but why it happens, and how it matters to the people living it. And that's a much richer experience than simply following a linear superhero narrative. And what really fascinates me, the more I think about it, is how the film treats the concept of legacy. Legacy isn't just a buzzword here, it's embedded in the DNA of the story. Thor is confronting his own place in the grand cosmic order. Jane is grappling with what it means to wield power when mortality is pressing in, and Gorr represents the other side of that coin. Someone whose perceived lack of legacy drives him to desperate measures. The way the film contrasts these perspectives is surprisingly thoughtful. It's not just Thor saving the day or Jane proving herself. It's an exploration of how individuals navigate meaning, responsibility, and the weight of their choices when the universe is literally so much bigger than them. And the emotional resonance comes through in small, deliberate moments. A glance, a hesitant gesture, a pause before speaking. These are beats that might be overlooked on a first watch because the spectacle and humor dominate the foreground. But on closer inspection, they're key to understanding the internal stakes. You can see Thor weighing the cost of his actions, even as he cracks a joke or hurls his hammer with confidence. You can see Jane balancing courage and vulnerability. And you can see Gorr's anger and sorrow as inseparable, almost symbiotic forces that define his every move. Visually, the film leans into symbolism in a way that feels both bold and subtle. The environments aren't just backdrops, they reflect the emotional and philosophical states of the characters. There are sequences where the color palette is intentionally stark, almost barren, emphasizing isolation or despair. Then, in scenes of hope or triumph, the colors explode, often to almost overwhelming saturation, reinforcing the thematic contrast. These choices aren't accidental. They're part of a deliberate visual vocabulary that communicates more than dialogue ever could. And speaking of communication, the way the film handles silence is notable. In a franchise often defined by rapid-fire dialogue, quips, and exposition, Love and Thunder allows itself quiet spaces, moments without words, where the framing, lighting, and performance carry the narrative. These silences often occur in the aftermath of action sequences or in confrontational standoffs. They give weight to the stakes and provide breathing room for reflection, both for the characters and for the audience. The film also explores the concept of worthiness in nuanced ways. Mjolnir isn't just a weapon, it's a moral and emotional measure. Who can wield it and why is tied directly to inner growth, understanding, and empathy. It's not arbitrary, and the film repeatedly plays with this theme in ways that connect directly to the arcs of Thor and Jane. Worthiness isn't static, it's something earned, something demonstrated through actions and choices rather than proclamations or superficial feats. Another subtle layer is the interplay between humor and pathos. The comedic beats are not just for levity, they're often designed to enhance the emotional impact when the tone shifts. Thor's self-deprecating humor, for instance, accentuates his moments of vulnerability, making his introspection more poignant. Jane's sharper wit frames her resilience and determination, highlighting her agency. And the villain's grim, ironic commentary often underscores the stakes, creating a tonal counterpoint that enriches the narrative texture. What's remarkable is how the film manages to balance these tonal and thematic complexities, while still delivering high-stakes, visually spectacular set pieces. The choreography of the action sequences is meticulous, with each movement serving narrative, emotional, and symbolic purposes. The camera work, timing, and framing all work together to convey not just physical conflict, but ideological and emotional tension. Thor's movements evolve across the film, reflecting his internal journey. More deliberate, more measured, less about brute strength and more about controlled, purposeful action. Even the soundtrack plays a significant role in shaping the film's emotional landscape. Music cues accentuate tonal shifts, character development, and narrative emphasis without ever feeling intrusive. Recurring motifs subtly tie together disparate sequences, creating an underlying cohesion that reinforces the arcs of Thor, Jane, and Gorr. The musical design demonstrates an understanding that the score isn't just accompaniment. It's a narrative tool that communicates emotion and tension in ways dialogue or visuals alone cannot. And then there's the structure of the story itself. At first glance, it may appear episodic, even disjointed, but the more you pay attention, the more you notice the deliberate pacing. High-energy, chaotic sequences are balanced with slower, introspective moments that give characters space to react, and audiences space to absorb the narrative and thematic beats. It's a rhythm that mirrors life. Sudden bursts of action, moments of reflection, moments of choice. And that approach reinforces the authenticity of character experiences within a larger-than-life context. Finally, it's the emotional risk-taking that makes the film memorable. The stakes aren't just cosmic, they're personal, moral, and philosophical. The characters are navigating grief, identity, responsibility, and the weight of belief. The film doesn't provide easy answers or neat resolutions for these questions, and that ambiguity, that refusal to sanitize the emotional complexity, is what gives it a lingering impact. You leave the theater or turn off the screen thinking about it, not just because of the spectacle, but because it engaged with something deeper, what it means to be human, even for gods, and how choices echo across time and space. The sum of all these elements, visual design, sound, pacing, humor, emotional stakes, philosophical exploration, and character arcs, coalesces into an experience that, while imperfect, is undeniably rich. It's a film that invites discussion, rewatching, and reflection. You can critique its tonal shifts, its humor, or its narrative leaps, but you can't deny that it's reaching for more than a typical superhero story. It's trying to balance spectacle with substance, absurdity with pathos, humor with introspection. And that tension, that constant negotiation, is what makes it both fascinating and, ultimately, worth experiencing. And I think one of the more intriguing aspects, when you step back and consider the broader narrative framework, is how Thor: Love and Thunder plays with the idea of consequence. It doesn't just present events in isolation, it's constantly reminding you that choices have reverberations. Thor's decisions, Jane's actions, even Gorr's vengeance ripple through the story in ways that aren't always immediately apparent. You can see it in small character reactions, in the environment around them, even in the way secondary characters respond. There's a tangible sense that the universe is living and breathing beyond what's on screen, and that's something you rarely get in a blockbuster of this scale. The supporting cast also contributes more than they might initially appear to. Valkyrie, Korg, and others are not just comic relief or sidekicks, they have agency and contribute to the thematic tapestry. Valkyrie's leadership and struggle with identity, for instance, mirror Thor's own questions about purpose and legacy. Korg provides levity, yes, but also wisdom in unexpected moments, grounding some of the more cosmic and chaotic elements in relatability. The film takes time to let these voices be heard, and it's that layered approach that adds depth. Technically, the film is fascinating in its use of CGI and practical effects. There's a tactile quality to certain sequences, the way Mjolnir lands, the texture of different realms, the interplay of light and shadow in pivotal confrontations, that prevents it from feeling completely digital. This balance between spectacle and tangible realism helps maintain immersion. Even when the narrative stretches into absurdity, the visual grounding keeps you invested. It's a subtle art that speaks to the meticulous work of the visual effects team and the director's eye for detail. Narrative motifs recur throughout, creating thematic resonance. You'll notice visual cues that mirror each other, musical cues that echo earlier emotional beats, and dialogue that references past choices. These aren't always overt, but they reward attentive viewing. They give the film a sense of cohesion, even when the tonal shifts might suggest otherwise. It's a reminder that every element, no matter how seemingly small, is deliberately placed to reinforce story and character. And then there's the interplay between humor and sincerity, which is handled with varying degrees of success. Some comedic beats land brilliantly, providing levity that enhances dramatic tension elsewhere. Others might feel overextended or undercut emotional weight. But the intention is clear. The humor is woven into character, not just spectacle. It tells you who these people are, how they relate to each other, and how they navigate a universe that is both absurd and threatening. That duality of comedy and existential stakes is tricky to balance, yet the film consistently leans into it, taking risks that few franchise films dare to attempt. Emotionally, the movie is surprisingly ambitious. It touches on grief, loss, hope, and redemption without turning them into heavy-handed lectures. Characters aren't reduced to archetypes. They feel real, flawed, and relatable despite their godly status. You see Thor wrestle with past failures and new responsibilities. Jane confronts mortality and the limits of her power. Gorr contends with anger, loss, and the moral ambiguities of vengeance. Each journey feels distinct, yet intertwined, and the film often juxtaposes these arcs to highlight philosophical questions about justice, mercy, and the nature of heroism. What's particularly clever is how these character arcs are supported visually. The color palette, framing, and cinematography reflect emotional subtext. Moments of isolation are framed with stark contrasts or emptiness in the environment. Triumphs are marked by expansive, vibrant compositions. Even subtle gestures, the tilt of a head, a hand movement, a glance, carry narrative weight. The filmmakers are telling a story not just through dialogue, but through a visual grammar that rewards attentive viewing. The film also doesn't shy away from risk in narrative structure. There are unexpected tonal shifts, daring set pieces, and moments that flirt with genre conventions, almost blending superhero spectacle with mythic drama, occasional absurdist comedy, and introspective character study. It's a hybrid that could easily have fallen apart, yet for much of the runtime, it sustains coherence. It's uneven, yes, but there's a confidence in the experimentation that makes the inconsistencies feel like part of the film's personality, rather than flaws. Even the dialogue is layered. On the surface, it delivers exposition, humor, and narrative propulsion. Beneath the surface, it often hints at philosophical or emotional undercurrents. Lines that seem flippant at first reveal deeper truths upon reflection. Jokes and quips sometimes double as character insight, and confrontations often carry thematic subtext about power, worthiness, and moral responsibility. It's a writing strategy that allows the film to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, entertaining the casual viewer while offering additional rewards for those willing to dig deeper. And perhaps the most compelling element is how the film handles stakes. In a universe where gods, cosmic entities, and multiversal consequences are standard fare, making danger feel real is challenging. Yet through careful character work, thoughtful pacing, and strategic tension building, the film makes you care. The outcomes aren't just about spectacle, they're about choices, growth, and consequence. When a character faces danger, the emotional resonance is tied to who they are and what they've endured, which elevates the tension far beyond any CGI-heavy sequence. The movie doesn't settle for easy triumphs. There are setbacks, morally gray moments, and choices that carry real weight. It trusts the audience to grapple with ambiguity, to recognize that heroism is not about perfection but persistence, about making hard decisions in imperfect circumstances. That layer of sophistication is often what separates the most memorable blockbusters from the forgettable ones. The willingness to challenge the audience emotionally and intellectually, even within a spectacle-driven narrative. And that willingness permeates the climax as well. It's structured to provide visual spectacle, narrative resolution, and emotional catharsis all at once. The film aligns these elements not simply for the sake of a traditional payoff, but in service of its characters' journeys and the philosophical questions it's been exploring throughout. Victory isn't just measured in action beats, it's measured in growth, understanding, and reconciliation, both with oneself and with others. That integration of spectacle and substance is rare, and it's a testament to the filmmaker's ambition, even if some tonal inconsistencies occasionally undermine it. It's also worth reflecting on how the film situates itself within the larger franchise context. It acknowledges past events without being entirely beholden to them, creating space for new narratives while respecting the legacy of previous installments. Characters carry their histories, but they're allowed to evolve. This balance between continuity and reinvention is delicate, and the film navigates it with varying degrees of success, but the effort is evident. It's not just a standalone adventure, it's a continuation that seeks to deepen character and thematic exploration while still delivering the spectacle expected by fans. Perhaps the most striking takeaway is that the movie isn't afraid to be imperfect. It embraces complexity, ambiguity, and risk. Its tonal shifts, narrative leaps, and occasional unevenness are part of its identity, reflecting a creative team willing to push boundaries and experiment within the blockbuster framework. And for an audience accustomed to formulaic entries, that willingness to take chances, even if it occasionally falters, makes the film memorable, compelling, and ultimately worth discussing long after the credits roll.